You'll always be poor, Emma. Some people are just born to struggle. Those words came from my sister Victoria at our family's Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, the same sister who had just inherited our Grainburst Trust Fund, while I received nothing but condolences. The same sister who had no idea she was about to watch me acquire enough shares in her precious private bank to become their largest individual shareholder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Richardson, and this is the story of how family wealth taught me that the most expensive thing you can inherit is other people's limitations about what you deserve to achieve. The Richardson family had always been about appearances, old money, and maintaining social position in Charleston's exclusive financial district. Our grandfather had established Richardson Holdings in the 1940s, building a portfolio of investments that had sustained 3 generations of comfortable living. The family operated with the kind of understated wealth that never discussed money directly but always ensured everyone understood exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. I had spent 25 years as the family disappointment, working as a junior analyst at a mid-tier investment firm, while Victoria collected quarterly dividends from the trust fund that grandfather had established specifically for his most financially responsible grandchild. The irony was not lost on me that financial responsibility had been determined by birth order rather than actual competence with money. Victoria worked at Magnolia Private Bank, one of Charleston's most prestigious financial institutions, where she held the title of Client Relations Manager. Her role involved maintaining relationships with high-net-worth families who had banked there for generations. It was work that required social connections rather than financial expertise, and Victoria excelled at making wealthy clients feel comfortable while discussing their portfolios over afternoon tea and charity luncheons. Our parents had never hidden their preference for Victoria's career path over mine. Investment analysis was viewed as technical work, something that required expertise but lacked the social prestige they valued. Private banking, particularly at an institution like Magnolia, represented the kind of refined financial work that maintained family status while building valuable connections within Charleston's elite circle. The Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything took place at our parents' mansion in the historic district, surrounded by the oil portraits and antique furniture that had accumulated over generations of Richardson prosperity. The dining room reflected old Charleston elegance, with its crystal chandelier casting warm light over mahogany furniture that had been crafted before the Civil War. Victoria arrived wearing a Chanel suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her confidence radiating the kind of assurance that comes from never having worried about money. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had been told since childhood that financial security was her birthright rather than something that needed to be earned through effort and competence. "Emma, you look tired," she observed as we gathered for cocktails before dinner. "The investment business must be exhausting with all those late nights analyzing numbers that never seem to add up to real wealth." Her comment was delivered with the kind of practiced concern that wealthy people use when discussing the struggles of those less fortunate. There was no malice in her tone, just the sincere belief that some people were naturally suited for prosperity, while others were destined to work harder for smaller rewards. "The analysis work is actually quite fascinating," I replied carefully. "I've been studying emerging market opportunities and identifying undervalued assets that major institutions tend to overlook." "Emerging markets," Victoria repeated with the slight smile she reserved for concepts she considered charmingly naive. "Father, didn't you say those kinds of investments are essentially gambling with other people's money?" Father nodded approvingly from his position near the fireplace, where he was discussing portfolio management with Uncle Charles, who served on Magnolia Private Bank's board of directors. "Speculative investments are not appropriate for serious wealth preservation, Victoria. That's why established families focus on conservative growth strategies rather than chasing market trends." The conversation continued in this vein throughout cocktails and into dinner, with Victoria positioning herself as the voice of financial wisdom while my work was characterized as interesting but ultimately impractical. The family's assessment was not intentionally cruel, but it was definitively dismissive of my professional capabilities and future prospects. "Emma has always been good with numbers," Mother added during the main course, But there's a difference between understanding mathematics and understanding money. Real wealth requires judgment that comes from experience and connections, not just analytical skill. The distinction being drawn was clear and had been reinforced throughout my childhood. Victoria possessed the social intelligence and family connections that enabled wealth preservation and growth. I possessed technical skills that were useful but insufficient for achieving significant financial success independently. As dinner progressed, Victoria began describing her recent promotion to Senior Client Relations Manager, a position that included oversight of some of Magnolia's largest private accounts. Her enthusiasm was genuine and her pride in the achievement was understandable, but the conversation inevitably turned to comparisons between our respective career trajectories. The wonderful thing about private banking, Victoria explained, is that you're working with families who have sustained wealth across generations. These clients understand that financial success is about relationships and trust, not just investment performance. They value stability and discretion over aggressive growth strategies. Uncle Charles nodded approvingly. Magnolia has served Charleston's finest families for over a century precisely because we understand that wealth preservation requires different skills than wealth creation. Victoria's role puts her at the center of relationships that have been cultivated over decades. That sounds incredibly fulfilling, I replied diplomatically, though I was beginning to understand that this conversation was leading toward a more explicit comparison between our professional achievements and prospects. It really is, Victoria continued. Just last week I was reviewing portfolio allocations with the Pemberton family, and they mentioned how much they appreciate working with someone who understands their values and priorities. That's the kind of relationship that creates lasting prosperity for everyone involved. The Pemberton family represented old Charleston money, the kind of clients whose accounts formed the foundation of Magnolia's business model. Managing their relationship successfully was indeed a significant professional achievement, and Victoria's pride in earning their trust was entirely justified. However, as I listened to her describe the intricacies of maintaining client relationships and preserving generational wealth, I found myself thinking about the analytical work I had been conducting on banking industry consolidation and the opportunities that might exist for investors who understood market dynamics better than traditional banking families. Over the past 18 months, I had been studying the private banking sector extensively, not because I intended to compete with Victoria's career path, but because I had identified significant inefficiencies in how regional banks manage their capital allocation and growth strategy. My analysis suggested that several prestigious institutions were undervalued by public markets precisely because their business models prioritized stability over aggressive expansion. This research had begun as an intellectual exercise, a way to apply my analytical skills to an industry I understood through family connection. However, the deeper I delved into financial statements and regulatory filings, the more convinced I became that opportunities existed for investors who could recognize value that traditional financial wisdom overlooked. Magnolia Private Bank in particular had caught my attention during my research. The institution maintained an excellent reputation among Charleston's elite families, but their conservative growth strategies had resulted in stock performance that significantly lagged broader financial sector returns. Their focus on relationship-based banking created stable revenue streams but limited their ability to capitalize on emerging market opportunities. More importantly, my analysis revealed that Magnolia's current shareholders were primarily institutional investors and family trusts that prioritized dividend income over capital appreciation. This shareholder base created opportunities for individual investors who understood the bank's fundamental value proposition and could acquire meaningful positions without triggering the kind of market attention that might drive up prices prematurely. "Emma, you've been quiet during this discussion," Father observed as Victoria finished describing her latest client success stories. "How is your analytical work progressing? Have you identified any investment opportunities that might interest serious investors?" The question was posed with genuine curiosity, though I sensed an undercurrent of skepticism about whether my research would yield anything beyond academic interest. This was my opportunity to share the insights I had developed, but I also recognized that detailed discussion of investment strategies might be inappropriate for a family dinner setting. "I've been focusing on financial sector analysis," I replied carefully. There appear to be some interesting valuation disparities in the regional banking market, particularly among institutions that have maintained traditional business models, while larger banks have pursued aggressive expansion strategies. Regional banking, Uncle Charles said thoughtfully. That's certainly a stable sector, though not typically associated with significant growth opportunities. Most regional banks are valued appropriately based on their conservative risk profiles and limited expansion prospects. That's exactly what makes the opportunity interesting, I continued, feeling more confident as the conversation moved toward technical analysis. Markets often price regional banks based on historical performance patterns, without fully accounting for potential value creation through strategic repositioning or market consolidation. Victoria looked confused by the direction of the conversation. Are you suggesting that traditional banking approaches are somehow inefficient? Because Magnolia's clients specifically choose us because we prioritize stability and relationship management over speculative growth strategies. Regional banking, Uncle Charles said thoughtfully. That's certainly a stable sector, though not typically associated with significant growth opportunities. Most regional banks are valued appropriately based on their conservative risk profiles and limited expansion prospects. That's exactly what makes the opportunity interesting, I continued, feeling more confident as the conversation moved toward technical analysis. Markets often price regional banks based on historical performance patterns, without fully accounting for potential value creation through strategic repositioning or market consolidation. Victoria looked confused by the direction of the conversation. Are you suggesting that traditional banking approaches are somehow inefficient? Because Magnolia's clients specifically choose us because we prioritize stability and relationship management over speculative growth strategies. I'm not criticizing traditional banking approaches, I clarify. I'm observing that conservative business models can create investment opportunities for people who understand how to value stability appropriately while identifying catalyst for future growth. The distinction was important because I was not suggesting that Victoria's employer was poorly managed or that their business model was flawed. Rather, I was identifying market inefficiencies that created opportunities for informed investors to acquire valuable assets at prices that did not fully reflect their intrinsic worth. That sounds like a very theoretical approach to investment analysis, Mother said gently. Have you found any practical applications for these insights? Or are they primarily academic exercises? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This question struck at the heart of the family's perception of my work. They viewed my analytical capabilities as intellectually impressive, but practically limited, suitable for identifying interesting patterns, but insufficient for generating meaningful financial return. Their assessment reflected the broader cultural bias toward inherited wealth over earned wealth, relationship-based success over competence-based achievement. I've been making some small investments based on my research, I replied, choosing my words carefully to avoid revealing the full scope of my activity. The positions are modest, but they're performing according to my analysis and providing valuable real-world validation of the theoretical framework. Victoria laughed, not unkindly but with the confident amusement of someone who worked with truly substantial sums of money. Small investments are certainly a good way to learn, Emma. How much are we talking about? A few $1,000s here and there. The question revealed Victoria's assumption about my financial capabilities and investment capacity. From her perspective, someone working as a junior analyst at a mid-tier firm would naturally be limited to small-scale investments that might generate modest returns, but could never produce the kind of wealth that the Richardson family considered significant. The amounts vary depending on the opportunity, I replied diplomatically, unwilling to provide specific figures that might either embarrass me if they seemed small, or create skepticism if they seemed larger than my family expected. Well, just be careful not to get carried away with speculative positions, Father advised. Investment analysis is valuable training, but wealth preservation requires patience and conservative strategies that can withstand market volatility over extended periods. Emma has always been ambitious, Victoria added with affectionate concern, Just remember that building real wealth takes time and usually requires the kind of institutional relationships that can't be developed through individual analysis alone. This comment crystallized the fundamental disagreement between Victoria's approach to financial success and my own. She believed that wealth creation required access to established networks and institutional resources that were typically inherited rather than earned. I believed that wealth creation required understanding market dynamics and identifying opportunities that others overlooked due to conventional thinking or limited analytical capabilities. You make excellent points, I acknowledge. Building substantial wealth certainly requires patience and strategic thinking. Exactly, Victoria said, warming to her theme. That's why I'm so grateful to be working at Magnolia, where I can learn from families who have preserved and grown their wealth across multiple generations. Their experience provides insights that no amount of individual research could replicate. Uncle Charles nodded approvingly. Magnolia's client families have weathered numerous market cycles and economic disruptions by focusing on fundamental principles rather than chasing short-term opportunities. Their wisdom comes from experience that spans decades, sometimes centuries. The conversation was reinforcing the family's belief system about wealth and success. From their perspective, financial achievement required access to established institutions, inherited wisdom, and relationship networks that provided stability and continuity across generations. Individual analysis and independent investment strategies were viewed as interesting but fundamentally limited approaches that could not compete with institutional advantage. As dinner drew to a close and we moved to the library for coffee and cognac, Victoria approached me with the kind of sisterly concern that wealthy people often express when worried about family members who appear to be making poor financial decisions. Emma, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but I'm concerned about some of the things you said tonight regarding investment strategies and market opportunities. What specifically concerns you? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Well, you seem to believe that individual analysis can identify opportunities that major institutions and experienced investors have somehow missed. That kind of thinking can lead to overconfidence and significant financial loss. Her concern was sincere, and her analysis was not entirely unreasonable. Many individual investors did indeed overestimate their capabilities and make poor decisions based on incomplete information or unrealistic expectations about market opportunities. I appreciate your concern, I replied. I try to be very careful about distinguishing between genuine opportunities and wishful thinking. The thing is, Victoria continued, people who work in the financial industry often develop the illusion that they understand markets better than they actually do. It's easy to confuse analytical skills with investment wisdom, especially when you're working with small amounts of money that don't really test your judgment under pressure. This comment stung because it captured exactly how my family viewed my professional capability. They saw me as someone who possessed technical skills, but lacked the judgment and resources necessary for achieving meaningful financial success. My analytical work was characterized as intellectually interesting but practically ineffective. You raise important points about the difference between analysis and implementation, I acknowledged. Here's what I really want you to understand, Victoria said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering important advice. Some people are naturally suited for building wealth and others are better suited for different types of work. There's nothing wrong with being in the second category, but it's important to be realistic about your limitations. The words landed with precision, summarizing everything my family believed about my potential and prospects. Victoria was not being cruel, she was being honest according to her understanding of how the world worked. From her perspective, I was someone who would always struggle financially because I lacked the natural advantages that enable significant wealth accumulation. I understand your perspective, I said quietly. You'll always be poor, Emma, she continued with gentle finality. Some people are just born to struggle, but that doesn't mean you can't have a fulfilling life doing work that matters, even if it doesn't lead to financial independence. The statement hung in the air between us, crystallizing years of family assumptions about my capabilities and future prospects. Victoria had articulated what everyone believed but had been too polite to say directly, that I would never achieve the kind of financial success that the Richardson family considered meaningful. As I drove home that evening through Charleston's historic streets, passing the elegant mansions and exclusive clubs that represented the world Victoria inhabited naturally, I reflected on the conversation and its implication. My family's assessment was not based on malice or jealousy, but on their sincere belief that financial success required advantages that I did not possess. However, as I considered Victoria's prediction that I would always be poor, I found myself thinking about the research I had been conducting and the investment positions I had been building systematically over the past 18 months. The work was not theoretical or speculative, as my family assumed, but was based on rigorous analysis of market inefficiencies and careful evaluation of risk-adjusted return opportunity. More specifically, I had been accumulating shares in Magnolia Private Bank through a series of small purchases designed to avoid market attention while building a significant position in an undervalued institution. My analysis suggested that the bank's conservative business model and excellent reputation created fundamental value that public markets were pricing inefficiently. The irony was profound. Victoria worked for the institution where I was quietly becoming one of the largest individual shareholders, building wealth through the same conservative, relationship-focused business model that she championed, but using analytical skills she dismissed as impractical. Her prediction that I would always be poor was about to be tested by market forces that neither she nor the rest of my family understood. The transformation was already underway, though it would be months before anyone realized that the family disappointment had been systematically building a financial position that would redefine everyone's understanding of what Emma Richardson was capable of achieving. That night I reviewed my investment portfolio and smiled at the irony of the situation. While my family celebrated Victoria's success in managing other people's wealth, I had been quietly building my own. The junior analyst they dismissed as financially naive had been studying their world more carefully than they realized, and the results were about to surprise everyone. The foundation of financial dismissal had been laid at that Thanksgiving dinner, but it would also become the foundation of the most satisfying transformation I had ever experienced. Sometimes the most expensive lesson you can teach someone is that their limitations exist only in their imagination, not in your reality. The morning after Thanksgiving dinner arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Charleston's historic district appear even more magnificent than usual. I walked to my office at Meridian Financial Services through streets lined with centuries-old mansions, each one representing the kind of generational wealth that my family considered the only legitimate form of financial success. The contrast between their world of inherited prosperity and my world of earned achievement had never felt more pronounced than it did that morning. Meridian Financial occupied a modest building in the business district, far from the prestigious addresses where institutions like Magnolia Private Bank conducted their affairs. Our offices were functional rather than elegant, designed for analytical work rather than client entertainment. The atmosphere reflected our focus on research and investment performance, rather than relationship management and social networking. My desk was organized with the precision that 4 years of financial analysis had taught me to value. Multiple monitors displayed real-time market data, research reports, and the spreadsheets where I tracked the investment positions that my family dismissed as insignificant. What they did not realize was that those modest positions represented the foundation of a strategy that had been generating consistent returns while building towards something much more substantial. The Magnolia Private Bank position had become my primary focus over the past 6 months. My analysis indicated that the institution was fundamentally undervalued by public markets, primarily because investors failed to appreciate the stability and long-term growth potential of their relationship-based business model. While other financial institutions pursued aggressive expansion strategies that increased risk exposure, Magnolia maintained conservative practices that generated steady returns and preserved capital during market volatility. More importantly, My research revealed specific catalysts that could drive significant appreciation in Magnolia's stock price over the coming months. Regulatory changes in the banking industry were creating opportunities for well-capitalized regional banks to expand their market share. Interest rate trends were favoring institutions with conservative lending practices and strong deposit bases. Most significantly, industry consolidation was making smaller banks attractive acquisition targets for larger institutions seeking to expand their presence in affluent markets. Victoria's casual dismissal of my analytical capabilities had inadvertently provided me with valuable insights into Magnolia's internal operations and strategic planning. Her descriptions of client relationships, business development initiatives, and management decisions gave me information that was not available through public financial statements or regulatory filing. She was unknowingly providing competitive intelligence that enhanced my investment thesis considerably. The irony was particularly satisfying because Victoria believed she was demonstrating her superior understanding of the financial services industry, while actually confirming my analysis of Magnolia's fundamental strengths and market position. Her pride in the institution's conservative approach and relationship focus validated my assessment that the bank represented exceptional value for investors who could recognize quality assets trading at discounted prices. My phone rang, interrupting my morning review of overnight market developments. The caller identification showed the name of my broker, someone I had been working with for the past 2 years as my investment activities had grown more sophisticated and substantial. "Emma, I wanted to discuss your recent instructions regarding the Magnolia Private Bank position," he said without preamble. "You've been accumulating shares consistently, and your current holdings represent a significant concentration in a single security. I want to make sure you're comfortable with the risk exposure." The conversation was one I had been anticipating as my position in Magnolia continued to grow. Professional investment managers are trained to advise clients about diversification and risk management, particularly when individual holdings become large relative to total portfolio value. However, my concentration in Magnolia was deliberate rather than accidental, based on comprehensive analysis rather than emotional attachment. "I appreciate your concern about concentration risk," I replied. "However, my position in Magnolia is based on fundamental analysis that suggests the stock is significantly undervalued relative to its intrinsic worth. The concentration reflects my confidence in the investment thesis rather than lack of attention to risk management." "I understand your reasoning, but I need to make sure you're aware that your current holdings in Magnolia represent approximately 40% of your total investment portfolio. That level of concentration in a single security, regardless of its quality, exposes you to company-specific risks that could result in substantial losses if your analysis proves incorrect." The broker's concern was professionally appropriate and personally well-intentioned. From his perspective, I was a young investor who might be allowing overconfidence to override prudent risk management practices. He could not know that my analysis of Magnolia was based on insights and information that were not available to typical market participants. "Your point about concentration risk is valid," I acknowledged. "However, I believe the potential returns justify the risk exposure, particularly given my confidence in the underlying business fundamentals and the catalysts I've identified for future appreciation." "Can you share some specifics about your analysis? I'd like to understand what makes you so confident about this particular investment." The request presented a delicate situation. I could not reveal that my sister worked at Magnolia and had been inadvertently providing me with valuable intelligence about the bank's operations and strategic planning. I also could not disclose the full extent of my research without revealing information that might be considered material and non-public, even though I had obtained it through legitimate analysis rather than insider sources. My analysis focuses on several factors. I began carefully. Magnolia's business model generates stable revenue streams through relationship-based banking services that are difficult for competitors to replicate. Their conservative risk management practices have resulted in consistently strong credit quality metrics. The bank's market position in Charleston's affluent demographic provides natural barriers to entry that protect their client base from competitive pressure. Those are certainly positive characteristics, but they don't necessarily translate to significant stock price appreciation. Magnolia has been a stable performer, but not a growth story that would justify concentration at current valuation levels. That's where I believe the market is making a mistake. I continued. The stability and conservative practices that investors view as limiting growth potential actually position Magnolia to benefit from industry trends that favor well-capitalized regional banks. Regulatory changes, interest rate dynamics, and consolidation opportunities are creating catalysts that could drive substantial appreciation for institutions with Magnolia's profile. The broker was quiet for a moment, presumably reviewing his own research on Magnolia and considering my analysis. Professional investment managers encounter many clients who believe they have discovered undervalued securities, and most of those beliefs prove to be incorrect. However, my systematic approach and detailed reasoning suggested that my position was based on genuine analysis, rather than wishful thinking. Your reasoning is sophisticated, and I can see that you've done considerable research, he said finally. However, I still recommend that you consider reducing your concentration in Magnolia and diversifying into other securities that might offer similar risk-adjusted return potential. I understand your recommendation, but I prefer to maintain my current position for now. I believe the next 6 to 12 months will validate my analysis and demonstrate that the concentration risk was justified by the return potential. After ending the conversation, I reflected on the gap between professional investment advice and contrarian investment strategy. Brokers and financial advisors are trained to recommend diversification and risk management because those approaches work well for most investors most of the time. However, exceptional returns often require accepting higher levels of risk and maintaining conviction in analysis that contradicts conventional wisdom. My position in Magnolia represented exactly that kind of contrarian thinking. While other investors focused on growth stocks and technology companies, I had identified value in a traditional banking institution that most market participants considered boring and limited in potential. While financial advisors recommended diversification, I had concentrated my resources in a single investment that I understood thoroughly and believed offered exceptional risk-adjusted return. The afternoon brought an unexpected phone call that would crystallize my understanding of how my family's financial world actually operated. Victoria's name appeared on my caller identification, which was unusual because she rarely contacted me during business hours. "Emma, I have some exciting news to share," she began with enthusiasm that was immediately contagious. "I've been selected to participate in Magnolia's Executive Development Program, which means I'll be working directly with senior management on strategic planning and business development initiatives." The news was genuinely exciting for Victoria's career advancement, but it also represented an opportunity for me to gain even deeper insights into Magnolia's operations and future plans. The Executive Development Program would give Victoria access to information about the bank's strategic direction, competitive positioning, and growth opportunities that was not available through public sources. "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity for professional development." "It really is. The program involves working on projects with the executive team, including market analysis, competitive assessment, and strategic planning for the next 3 to 5 years. I'll be learning directly from people who have built Magnolia into one of Charleston's most respected financial institutions." "What kinds of projects will you be working on?" "The focus areas include expansion into new market segments, technology investment priorities, and evaluation of potential acquisition opportunities." Magnolia is considering several strategic initiatives that could significantly expand our business over the coming year. The information Victoria was sharing represented exactly the kind of strategic intelligence that could validate or refine my investment thesis. If Magnolia was seriously considering expansion and acquisition strategies, it suggested that management recognized opportunities for growth that were not reflected in current stock valuation. More importantly, their willingness to invest in strategic initiatives indicated confidence in their competitive position and financial resources. "That sounds fascinating," I replied, encouraging her to share additional details. "Are the expansion plans focused on geographic markets or service offerings?" "Both, actually. Management believes that Magnolia's relationship-based approach could be successful in other affluent markets throughout the South. They're also considering expanding service offerings to include investment management and estate planning services that would complement our traditional banking relationship. The strategic direction Victoria described aligned perfectly with my analysis of Magnolia's potential for growth and expansion. The bank's strong capital position and excellent reputation provided a foundation for geographic expansion, while their client relationships created natural opportunities for expanded service offerings. Most importantly, both strategies would increase revenue and profitability without requiring fundamental changes to their proven business model. Have they identified specific markets or timeline for these initiatives? The timeline depends on various factors, including regulatory approval and market conditions, but management is optimistic about implementing the first phase within the next 12 to 18 months. They're particularly interested in markets like Savannah and Asheville, where demographic profiles are similar to Charleston. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Victoria sharing details about Magnolia's competitive analysis, technology investments, and management priorities that provided valuable context for my investment decision. She was clearly excited about her increased responsibilities and the opportunity to contribute to strategic planning at an institution she genuinely respected. However, as I listened to her describe Magnolia's plans and potential, I found myself thinking about the dramatic irony of the situation. Victoria was sharing information that reinforced my confidence in an investment that she would undoubtedly view as inappropriate and risky if she knew about it. She was unknowingly providing intelligence that would help me build wealth through the same institution where she was building her career. Emma, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are your own investment activities progressing? Victoria asked toward the end of our conversation. I know you've been studying financial markets, and I'm curious whether you found any interesting opportunity. The question presented another delicate moment. Victoria's tone suggested genuine interest rather than condescension, but I remained cautious about revealing details that might invite unwanted scrutiny or advice about my investment strategy. I've been focusing on financial sector investments, particularly regional banks that appear to be undervalued relative to their fundamental strength, I replied carefully. Regional banks are certainly a stable investment category, though they're not typically associated with significant growth potential. Most of them trade at reasonable valuations that reflect their limited expansion prospects. That's exactly what makes some of them interesting from a value perspective, I continued. Markets often price regional banks based on historical performance without fully accounting for strategic opportunities or industry trends that could drive future growth. I suppose that's possible, though I would caution you about overestimating growth potential in a mature industry like banking. Most regional banks face significant competitive pressures that limit their ability to expand market share or improve profitability substantially. Victoria's response reflected the conventional wisdom about regional banking that created the investment opportunity I was exploiting. Market participants, including industry professionals like Victoria, often underestimated the potential for well-managed regional banks to benefit from industry consolidation, regulatory changes, and demographic trends that favored their business model. You make valid points about competitive pressures, I acknowledged. However, I believe some regional banks are positioned to benefit from trends that may not be fully appreciated by current market valuation. Well, just be careful not to invest more than you can afford to lose, Victoria advised with sisterly concern. Regional bank stocks can be volatile, and you don't want to put your financial security at risk chasing speculative gains. The advice was well-intentioned but revealed Victoria's continued assumption that my investment activities involved small amounts of money that represented disposable income rather than serious wealth-building strategy. She could not imagine that I might be pursuing investment opportunities with the same level of sophistication and commitment that she applied to her professional responsibilities. I appreciate your concern, I replied diplomatically. Actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Victoria continued, her tone becoming more serious. Mother and father have been talking about your financial situation, and they're concerned that you might be taking unnecessary risks with your investment. The statement revealed that my family's Thanksgiving dinner conversation had continued beyond my presence, with additional discussions about my financial capabilities and decision. Their concern was undoubtedly sincere, but it also demonstrated their persistent belief that I required guidance and oversight regarding money management. What specifically concerns them? They're worried that you might be developing unrealistic expectations about investment returns or taking positions that are too large relative to your income and saving. Father mentioned that young professionals sometimes overestimate their analytical abilities and make poor financial decisions as a result. The assessment was particularly ironic, given that my investment performance over the past 2 years had substantially exceeded market returns and demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical capabilities that my family believed I lacked. However, I could not defend my results without revealing information that might invite unwanted scrutiny or advice. I try to be very careful about risk management and position sizing. I'm sure you do, but sometimes people who work in the financial industry develop overconfidence about their investment skills. The analytical work you do is valuable, but it's different from actually managing substantial amounts of money under real-world conditions. Victoria's comment captured the essence of my family's perspective on my capabilities and limitations. They viewed my professional work as intellectually interesting but practically limited, suitable for supporting other people's investment decisions, but insufficient for generating meaningful wealth independently. You raise important points about the difference between analysis and implementation. I acknowledged. Here's what I really want you to understand, Victoria said with the intensity of someone delivering crucial advice. Building real wealth requires patience, conservative strategies, and access to opportunities that typically come through professional relationships and institutional connection. Individual stock picking, especially in specialized sectors like regional banking, is essentially gambling with money you can't afford to lose. The characterization of my investment strategy as gambling was particularly frustrating because it revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that shaped my family's assessment of my financial capability. They could not conceive that systematic analysis and disciplined execution could produce results that rivaled or exceeded those achieved through inherited advantages and institutional relationships. I understand your perspective, I said quietly. The thing is, Emma, some people are naturally suited for building and preserving wealth, while others are better suited for different types of contribution. There's nothing wrong with being in the second category, but it's important to be realistic about your limitations and focus on financial strategies that match your actual circumstances. The conversation was approaching the same conclusion that had characterized our Thanksgiving dinner discussion, with Victoria positioning herself as the voice of financial wisdom, while my aspirations were characterized as unrealistic and potentially dangerous. However, this time her assessment felt even more dismissive, because it was delivered in the context of her own career advancement and increased access to strategic information. Actually, there's one more thing I wanted to mention, Victoria added. Magnolia is hosting a client reception next month to celebrate the expansion of our private banking services. It's invitation only for families with substantial assets under management, but I might be able to arrange for you to attend as my guest if you're interested in learning more about how serious wealth management actually works. The offer was meant kindly, representing Victoria's genuine desire to help me understand the world of high-net-worth financial services. However, it also reflected her assumption that I would benefit from observing wealth management practices rather than participating in them as a principal. That's a generous offer, I replied. I'll certainly consider it. The reception will include presentations about investment strategies, estate planning, and wealth preservation techniques that successful families use to maintain their financial positions across generations. It might provide valuable perspective on the difference between individual investment activities and institutional wealth management. After ending the conversation, I sat in my office, reflecting on the profound irony of Victoria's invitation. She was offering to introduce me to Magnolia's wealth management services as an educational opportunity, unaware that I was already one of the bank's largest individual shareholders and would soon be in a position to influence the strategic decisions she was so excited to participate in develop. The revelation moment had crystallized my understanding of how my family's financial world operated and where I stood within their hierarchy of capability and potential. Victoria's career advancement and increased access to strategic information represented everything they valued about financial success: institutional relationships, professional recognition, and insider access to decision-making processes. However, their assessment of my financial capabilities remained anchored to assumptions about my limitations, rather than evidence of my achievement. They could not recognize that the analytical skills they dismissed as impractical had enabled me to identify and exploit investment opportunities that their institutional advantages had not revealed to them. The gap between their perception and my reality was about to become much more significant as my position in Magnolia continued to grow and the catalysts I had identified began to drive stock price appreciation. The family member they viewed as financially naive was systematically building a position that would soon make me one of the most influential shareholders in the institution where Victoria was building her career. The revelation moment had shown me exactly how exclusive my family's definition of financial success had become, and how completely they had excluded me from their vision of who could achieve meaningful wealth. However, it had also shown me that their exclusion was based on ignorance rather than insight, assumption rather than analysis. The transformation was accelerating, though Victoria and the rest of my family remained unaware that the person they were advising about financial limitations was already proving that their advice was based on fundamental misunderstanding of both my capabilities and the opportunities available to those willing to think independently about wealth creation. The next phase of my strategy would involve building my position in Magnolia while using the intelligence Victoria continued to provide unknowingly. The sister who believed she was educating me about financial reality was actually helping me build the foundation for a transformation that would redefine everything our family believed about money, success, and who deserves to achieve both. The weeks following Victoria's phone call about her promotion marked a fundamental shift in my psychological approach to wealth building and family relationships. The conversation had crystallized something that had been developing gradually over months of analytical work and investment execution. I no longer sought validation from people who had already decided what I was capable of achieving. Instead, I began channeling their dismissal into systematic action that would prove their limitations existed in their imagination rather than my reality. The transformation was both subtle and profound. Every morning when I arrived at Meridian Financial, I approached my work with the focused intensity of someone building toward a specific goal rather than simply performing assigned tasks. My analytical responsibilities provided excellent training in financial markets and investment evaluation, but they had become secondary to my primary objective of accumulating a position in Magnolia Private Bank that would eventually command respect through sheer financial leverage. My research into Magnolia had evolved far beyond traditional investment analysis. I was studying the institution with the thoroughness of someone preparing to influence its strategic direction rather than simply profit from its stock price appreciation. This research encompassed everything from regulatory filings and competitive analysis to detailed examination of their lending practices, deposit growth trends, and management compensation structure. The depth of my investigation revealed opportunities and vulnerabilities that would not have been apparent through conventional analytical approaches. Magnolia's conservative business model had created exceptional stability and client loyalty, but it had also resulted in operational inefficiencies and missed growth opportunities that more aggressive management might have captured. The institution was fundamentally sound but under-optimized, which created potential for significant value creation under different strategic leadership. More importantly, my analysis revealed that Magnolia's current shareholder base consisted primarily of institutional investors and family trusts that prioritized dividend income over operational involvement. Most shareholders were passive investors who valued stability and consistent returns, rather than active participants interested in influencing management decisions or strategic direction. This shareholder composition created an opportunity for someone with sufficient ownership percentage to exercise meaningful influence over corporate governance and strategic planning. The mathematical progression toward meaningful ownership had become my primary focus. Each month I allocated every available dollar toward purchasing additional Magnolia shares, building my position systematically while avoiding market attention that might drive up prices or attract competitive buyers. The process required patience and discipline, but it was generating exactly the kind of concentrated wealth that my family believed I was incapable of creating. My broker continued expressing concern about concentration risk, but his warnings had become routine rather than persuasive. Professional investment advisors are trained to recommend diversification because it works well for most investors most of the time. However, exceptional wealth creation often requires concentrated positions in carefully selected opportunities, combined with thorough understanding of the underlying business fundamentals and strategic catalysts that drive value appreciation. The Magnolia position represented exactly that kind of calculated concentration, rather than spreading my investment across multiple securities with moderate potential. I had identified one institution that I understood comprehensively and believed offered exceptional risk-adjusted return. The concentration reflected confidence rather than recklessness, analysis rather than speculation. During this period, I began keeping detailed records of my family's comments and predictions about my financial future. The documentation was not intended for confrontational purposes, but rather as motivation to maintain focus when conventional wisdom suggested that my strategy was inappropriate or unrealistic. Every dismissive comment became additional fuel for the systematic wealth building that would eventually prove their assessments incorrect. Victoria's continued updates about her work at Magnolia provided valuable intelligence that reinforced my conviction about the institution's potential. Her descriptions of management meetings, strategic planning sessions, and client development initiatives confirmed that the bank was positioned for significant growth under leadership that understood how to capitalize on their competitive advantages and market position. However, Victoria's communications also revealed management's limited vision regarding expansion opportunities and strategic positioning. The executive team was competent and conservative, focused on maintaining their current market position rather than pursuing aggressive growth strategies that might maximize shareholder value. Their approach was entirely appropriate for preserving institutional stability, but it left substantial value creation potential unrealized. This gap between current performance and optimal potential represented exactly the kind of opportunity that activist investors seek to exploit. A shareholder with sufficient ownership percentage could advocate for strategic initiatives that would enhance profitability and growth without compromising the conservative risk management practices that made Magnolia attractive to affluent clients. The prospect of eventually influencing Magnolia's strategic direction provided additional motivation beyond simple financial return. I was not just building wealth through stock appreciation, but positioning myself to demonstrate that analytical capabilities and independent thinking could identify and capture opportunities that conventional institutional wisdom overlooked. My investment strategy had evolved into something much more ambitious than individual wealth creation. I was building toward a transformation that would validate everything I believed about competence, merit, and the power of systematic analysis to generate results that inherited advantages could not achieve. The psychological shift was liberating in ways that extended far beyond financial planning. For the first time in my adult life, I was pursuing goals that I had established independently, rather than seeking approval for aspirations that others considered appropriate or realistic. The energy that I had previously devoted to earning recognition from family members was now channeled toward creating value that would demand recognition regardless of their prior assumptions about my capabilities. This reorientation affected every aspect of my daily routine and long-term plan. I began reading extensively about corporate governance, shareholder activism, and strategic management, developing expertise that would enable me to participate effectively in high-level business discussions once my ownership position justified such involvement. The education was comprehensive and systematic, designed to ensure that my eventual influence over Magnolia's direction would be based on genuine competence rather than simply financial leverage. My social life also began shifting as I reduced time spent in family settings, where my aspirations were consistently dismissed, and increased engagement with professional networks, where my analytical capabilities were recognized and valued. This transition was gradual but deliberate, reflecting my growing understanding that transformation requires changes in environment as well as mindset. The colleagues at Meridian Financial who knew about my investment activities were uniformly supportive and encouraging. They understood the analytical foundation underlying my strategy and respected the discipline required to execute concentrated investment positions effectively. Their perspective provided valuable contrast to my family's assessment, demonstrating that competent professionals recognized potential that my relatives could not see. However, I was careful to avoid detailed discussions about the specific scope of my Magnolia position or my long-term objectives regarding shareholder influence. The strategy was too unconventional and ambitious to risk exposure before it reached sufficient scale to be irreversible. The element of surprise would be crucial when the time came to reveal the transformation that had been developing outside my family's awareness or understanding. During quiet moments in my office, I often reflected on the profound irony of my situation. Victoria spent her days managing relationships with wealthy families who had accumulated their fortunes over generations, helping them preserve and grow assets that had been built through business success and investment wisdom. Meanwhile, I was systematically building wealth through the same institution where she worked, using analytical skills that she dismissed as impractical to identify opportunities that her wealthy clients had overlooked. The irony extended beyond simple role reversal. Victoria's work involved advising families about wealth preservation strategies, while she remained financially dependent on her salary and family trust distribution. I was building independent wealth through systematic investment activities, while being characterized as someone who would always struggle financially. The contrast highlighted fundamental differences in our approaches to financial success and personal independence. Victoria's strategy involved leveraging family connections and institutional relationships to build a career managing other people's money. My strategy involved developing analytical capabilities and investment expertise to build my own wealth independently of family advantages or institutional support. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they reflected different philosophies about the sources of financial security and the pathways to meaningful achievement. Victoria's approach was entirely reasonable and likely to produce stable, comfortable prosperity over time. My approach was riskier but offered potential for wealth creation that could exceed anything achievable through salary and family inheritance alone. The months of systematic investment and strategic planning had also taught me valuable lessons about patience and delayed gratification. Wealth building through stock accumulation requires the discipline to forego current consumption in favor of future financial independence. Every dollar allocated toward Magnolia shares was a dollar that could not be spent on immediate desires or lifestyle improvement. This sacrifice was particularly challenging because my current lifestyle was modest compared to the standard my family considered appropriate for someone with Richardson heritage. I lived in a small apartment, drove an older car, and maintained a budget that prioritized investment over consumption. The choices were deliberate and strategic, but they also reinforced my family's perception that I was struggling financially rather than building wealth systematically. The gap between my actual financial progress and my apparent circumstances was becoming increasingly significant. My net worth was growing substantially through stock appreciation and continued accumulation, but my visible lifestyle provided no indication of this progress. The discretion was essential for maintaining the element of surprise that would make the eventual revelation more impactful, but it also meant accepting continued family assumptions about my financial limitations. During this period, I also began studying the personal histories and career trajectories of successful activist investors and entrepreneurs who had built wealth through unconventional strategies. These case studies provided both inspiration and practical guidance about the challenges and opportunities associated with pursuing ambitious financial goals independently of traditional institutional support. The research revealed consistent patterns among individuals who had achieved exceptional results through contrarian thinking and systematic execution. Most had experienced early dismissal or rejection from establishment institutions. Most had developed specialized expertise in areas that conventional wisdom undervalued. Most had maintained discipline and focus despite external skepticism about their strategies and objectives. These parallels provided confidence that my approach was aligned with proven methods for creating wealth and influence through independent analysis and strategic positioning. The path was well documented, though rarely attempted by people with my background and circumstances. The psychological transformation during this period was as significant as the financial progress. I was developing the mindset and self-confidence necessary to pursue ambitious goals despite external opposition or indifference. The rejection I had experienced from family members was becoming fuel for determination rather than source of discouragement. This shift in perspective affected how I interpreted setbacks and challenges in all areas of my life. Problems became opportunities to develop problem-solving capabilities. Criticism became information about other people's limitations rather than evidence of my inadequacies. Obstacles became chances to demonstrate persistence and resourcefulness. The change was particularly evident in my professional interactions at Meridian Financial. I began contributing more assertively to team discussions about investment strategies and market analysis. My recommendations carried more weight with colleagues who recognized the quality of my research and the consistency of my analytical judgment. The confidence was building systematically through successful execution rather than external validation. However, I remained cautious about revealing too much about my personal investment activities or long-term objectives. The strategy was too unconventional to risk exposure before it reached sufficient scale to be undeniable. The secrecy was necessary but also isolating, creating a gap between my public persona and private activities that required careful management. The isolation was offset by the satisfaction of watching my analysis prove accurate through market performance and strategic developments. Magnolia's stock price had begun appreciating as other investors recognized the value that my research had identified months earlier. The appreciation validated my analytical capabilities while increasing the value of my accumulated positions substantially. More importantly, the developments Victoria described in her work confirmed that Magnolia's management was beginning to implement some of the strategic initiatives that my analysis had identified as value creation opportunities. The bank was expanding service offerings, pursuing geographic growth, and investing in technology improvements that would enhance profitability and competitive positioning. These developments were occurring exactly as my analysis had predicted, providing additional confirmation that my investment thesis was correct and my strategy was proceeding according to plan. The combination of stock price appreciation and strategic progress was building toward the moment when my position would become large enough to justify direct communication with management about additional opportunities for value creation. The awakening was complete. I was no longer seeking approval from people who had predetermined my limitations. I was no longer accepting external assessments of my potential or capability. I was systematically building wealth and influence through methods that would eventually prove that their rejection had been based on misunderstanding rather than insight. The transformation was accelerating, and the gap between their perception and my reality was widening with each passing month. Victoria continued sharing information about Magnolia's progress and potential, unknowingly providing intelligence that enhanced my strategy while remaining completely unaware that her dismissed sister was becoming one of the institution's most significant shareholders. The foundation was solid. The strategy was working, and the moment of revelation was approaching. Everything my family believed about money, success, and who deserves to achieve both was about to be challenged by results that would demand recognition regardless of their prior assumptions about my limitation. The transition from psychological transformation to practical preparation marked a critical phase in my strategy to build meaningful wealth and influence through systematic investment in Magnolia Private Bank. The months of accumulating shares and analyzing market opportunities had established a solid foundation, but achieving my ultimate objectives would require developing expertise that extended far beyond traditional investment analysis into areas of corporate governance, strategic management, and shareholder advocacy. My position in Magnolia had grown to represent nearly 60% of my total investment portfolio, reflecting both the appreciation of existing holdings and continued monthly purchases that steadily increased my ownership percentage. The concentration was substantial enough to attract attention from financial advisors who understood the risks associated with undiversified portfolios, but it remained below the threshold that would require public disclosure of my holdings or regulatory filing as a significant shareholder. The mathematical progression toward meaningful influence had become my primary focus during this preparation phase. Federal securities regulations require public disclosure when individual ownership reaches 5% of outstanding shares, which would trigger attention from management, other shareholders, and financial media. My analysis indicated that 5% ownership of Magnolia would require additional investment of approximately $800,000 at current market prices. This target represented a substantial financial commitment that would require careful planning and disciplined execution over the coming months. However, it also represented the threshold where my voice would carry genuine weight in discussions about corporate strategy, dividend policy, and management decisions. 5% ownership would transform me from anonymous investor to recognized stakeholder with legitimate authority to influence the institution's direction. The preparation required to exercise such influence effectively involved developing competencies that extended far beyond my current expertise in financial analysis and investment evaluation. Corporate governance operates according to complex legal frameworks and established protocols that require specialized knowledge to navigate success. Strategic management involves understanding operational details and competitive dynamics that are not apparent through public financial statements alone. I began dedicating evening hours and weekends to intensive study of these advanced topics, treating the education as seriously as any professional certification program. The curriculum I established for myself included corporate law, securities regulation, strategic planning methodologies, and case studies of successful shareholder activism campaigns conducted by investors who had achieved meaningful influence through systematic stock accumulation. The legal education was particularly important because effective shareholder advocacy requires understanding both the rights that ownership provides and the procedures through which those rights can be exercised. Federal and state regulations govern how shareholders can communicate with management, propose agenda items for annual meetings, and advocate for strategic changes without triggering additional regulatory requirements or legal complications. The case study research revealed consistent patterns among activist investors who had achieved significant results through strategic share accumulation and thoughtful engagement with corporate management. The most successful campaigns combined substantial ownership percentages with detailed understanding of industry dynamics and specific recommendations for value creation that management could evaluate objectively rather than dismiss as uninformed criticism. These examples provided both inspiration and practical guidance for structuring my eventual communication with Magnolia's management team. The approach would need to balance respect for their existing achievements with clear articulation of additional opportunities for growth and profitability that systematic analysis had identified. The goal was collaborative value creation rather than confrontational demands for change. During this intensive preparation period, Victoria continued providing valuable intelligence about Magnolia's internal operations and strategic planning through her regular updates about her executive development program responsibility. Her enthusiasm about participating in high-level strategic discussions was genuine and infectious, but it also revealed information that enhanced my understanding of the institution's current priorities and future opportunities. The expansion planning is more sophisticated than I initially realized, Victoria explained during one of our weekly phone conversations. Management has identified specific geographic markets where our relationship-based approach could be successful, and they've developed detailed financial projections for establishing new branch locations over the next 3 years. The expansion strategy Victoria described aligned with my own analysis of Magnolia's growth potential, but her access to internal financial projections provided validation that management was serious about pursuing these opportunities rather than simply considering them as theoretical possibilities. The timeline and market selection criteria she mentioned suggested that the executive team had conducted thorough market research and competitive analysis to support their expansion decisions. Have they discussed financing approaches for the expansion? I inquired, recognizing that capital allocation decisions would significantly impact shareholder returns and strategic flexibility. Actually, yeah, the financial planning assumes that expansion will be funded primarily through retained earnings and organic deposit growth, rather than external financing or equity dilution. Management believes that conservative financing approaches will maintain our competitive advantages while supporting sustainable growth. This information was particularly valuable because it indicated that Magnolia's expansion would not dilute existing shareholders or increase financial leverage in ways that might compromise the institution's conservative risk profile. The approach would preserve the characteristics that made Magnolia attractive to affluent clients while creating opportunities for increased profitability and market presence. The technology investment priorities are also interesting. Victoria continued. Management recognizes that digital banking capabilities are essential for attracting younger affluent clients, but they're focused on technology that enhances rather than replaces relationship-based service delivery. The technology strategy Victoria described reflected exactly the kind of balanced approach that would preserve Magnolia's competitive advantages while addressing evolving client expectations and operational efficiency opportunities. The investments would modernize the institution without compromising the personal service quality that differentiated them from larger commercial banks. These conversations with Victoria were invaluable for refining my understanding of Magnolia's strategic direction and management capability. However, they also highlighted the irony of my situation. Victoria was participating in strategic planning sessions where decisions were being made about the future of an institution where I was becoming one of the largest shareholders. Yet she remained completely unaware of my growing influence and eventual capacity to impact those same strategic discussions. The preparation phase also involved building relationships with professionals who could provide guidance and support when the time came to engage directly with Magnolia's management. I began networking within Charleston's legal and financial communities, establishing connections with attorneys who specialized in securities law and corporate governance, and with investment professionals who had experience in shareholder advocacy and strategic consulting. These networking activities required careful balance between building useful relationships and maintaining discretion about my specific objectives regarding Magnolia. The strategy was too sensitive to risk exposure before it reached sufficient scale to be irreversible, but the preparation would be essential for executing the plan effectively when the appropriate moment arrived. One particularly valuable relationship developed with Sarah Mitchell, a corporate attorney who had advised several successful activist investment campaigns involving regional financial institutions. Her expertise in securities regulation and shareholder rights provided crucial guidance about the legal frameworks and procedural requirements that would govern my eventual engagement with Magnolia's management. Shareholder activism in the banking sector requires especially careful attention to regulatory compliance, Sarah explained during one of our initial consultations. Financial institutions operate under federal oversight that can complicate activist campaigns if the legal requirements are not understood thoroughly. Her guidance helped me understand the specific disclosure requirements and communication protocols that would apply once my ownership percentage reached levels that triggered regulatory attention. The knowledge was essential for planning the timing and approach of my eventual transition from anonymous investor to recognized shareholder advocate. The key to successful engagement with bank management is demonstrating genuine understanding of their business model and regulatory environment, Sarah continued. Proposals for strategic changes must be realistic within the constraints of banking regulation and consistent with the institution's risk management requirements. This advice reinforced my commitment to developing comprehensive understanding of Magnolia's operations and competitive environment before attempting to influence strategic decisions. The preparation was not just about accumulating shares, but about building the expertise necessary to contribute meaningfully to discussions about the institution's future direction. The financial preparation was equally important as the educational and legal preparation. Reaching 5% ownership would require substantial additional investment that would significantly impact my personal financial position and risk exposure. The commitment was appropriate given my confidence in the analysis and strategy but it demanded careful planning to ensure that the concentration did not create unmanageable financial vulnerability. I began restructuring my personal finances to support the final phase of share accumulation while maintaining adequate liquidity for living expenses and emergency reserve. This process involved liquidating smaller investment positions, optimizing tax efficiency through strategic timing of transactions, and establishing credit facilities that could provide additional capital if exceptional buying opportunities emerge. The financial planning also required realistic assessment of the timeline for achieving meaningful returns on such a concentrated investment position. Share appreciation alone might generate substantial gains, but the most significant value creation would likely occur through strategic initiatives that could take several years to implement and demonstrate results. This long-term perspective was essential for maintaining discipline during periods when market volatility or short-term business challenges might create doubt about the wisdom of such concentrated exposure to a single institution. The strategy was based on fundamental analysis of long-term value creation potential rather than expectations of immediate gain. During the final months of the preparation phase, I began conducting detailed scenario analysis to anticipate various outcomes and prepare appropriate responses for different situations that might develop once my ownership position became significant enough to warrant management attention. The scenarios ranged from immediate acceptance of my recommendations to potential resistance or conflict that might require more assertive advocacy approach. The scenario planning was particularly important because banking regulations and corporate governance requirements would limit my flexibility to adjust strategies once my ownership percentage triggered disclosure requirements. The approach would need to be carefully planned and systematically executed, rather than developed reactively based on management responses or market conditions. One scenario that required especially careful consideration involved the possibility that Magnolia might become an acquisition target for larger financial institutions seeking to expand their presence in affluent markets. Significant ownership percentage would provide influence over acquisition negotiations and terms, but it would also require understanding of the valuation implications and strategic alternatives that might be available. The preparation for this possibility involved studying recent bank acquisition transactions, understanding typical premium levels and negotiation dynamics, and developing criteria for evaluating whether potential acquisition offers would represent appropriate value for shareholders. The analysis would be essential for making informed decisions about supporting or opposing acquisition proposals if such opportunities emerged. The personal transformation during this preparation phase was as significant as the financial and educational development. I was evolving from someone who analyzed investment opportunities for other people into someone who was building the capability to influence major corporate decisions through strategic shareholding and informed advocacy. This evolution required developing confidence and communication skills that would enable effective interaction with senior executives and board members who were accustomed to dealing with institutional investors and wealthy family offices. The conversations would involve sophisticated business concepts and strategic alternatives that demanded both technical competence and professional presence. I began practicing these interactions through role-playing exercises and mock presentations that simulated the kinds of discussions I would eventually have with Magnolia's management team. The preparation was systematic and thorough, designed to ensure that my eventual engagement would reflect genuine expertise rather than simply financial leverage. The months of intensive preparation were approaching completion as my ownership position reached approximately 4.7% of Magnolia's outstanding share. The threshold for mandatory disclosure was within reach, requiring approximately $60,000 of additional investment at current market prices. The moment when my transformation from anonymous investor to recognized shareholder would become irreversible was approaching rapidly. The preparation had been comprehensive and systematic, providing the legal knowledge, strategic expertise, and professional confidence necessary to engage effectively with corporate management and advocate successfully for value creation initiatives. The educational foundation was solid, the financial resources were available, and the strategic analysis had been validated through months of stock price appreciation and business development progress. Most importantly, the psychological preparation was complete. I was no longer the family member who sought approval for financial aspirations that others considered unrealistic. I was becoming an investor with sufficient ownership and expertise to demand recognition based on demonstrated capability rather than inherited advantage or institutional connection. The preparation phase was ending, and moment of transition was beginning. Everything my family believed about wealth creation, business influence, and who deserves to participate in important financial decisions was about to be challenged by results that would demand acknowledgement, regardless of their prior assumptions about my limitations or potential. The morning I executed the final purchase that would bring my ownership in Magnolia Private Bank to exactly 5.2% of outstanding shares marked the end of one phase of my strategy and beginning of another entirely different challenge. The transaction occurred at 9:37 on a Tuesday morning in early March, when market conditions provided an opportunity to acquire the remaining shares at a favorable price that brought my total investment to just over $1.3 million. The significance of crossing the 5% threshold extended far beyond the mathematical milestone. Federal securities regulations require disclosure of ownership positions exceeding 5% within 10 days of reaching that level, which meant that my anonymous accumulation strategy was about to become a matter of public record. The disclosure would trigger attention from Magnolia's management, other shareholders, financial analysts, and potentially media outlets that covered regional banking development. More importantly, the disclosure would mark my formal transition from individual investor to recognized stakeholder with legitimate standing to communicate directly with corporate management about strategic opportunities and operational improvement. The 5% ownership position provided both the legal authority and financial credibility necessary to request meetings with senior executives and advocate for specific initiatives that could enhance shareholder value. The preparation for this transition had been systematic and comprehensive, but the actual implementation required careful attention to regulatory compliance and strategic communication that would establish my credibility as a serious investor rather than a disruptive activist. The approach needed to balance legitimate advocacy for value creation with respect for management's existing achievements and institutional relationships. I had retained Sarah Mitchell to handle the legal aspects of the disclosure filing and to provide guidance about the communication protocols that would govern my engagement with Magnolia's management team. Her expertise in securities regulation and shareholder advocacy was essential for navigating the complex requirements and ensuring that my actions complied with all applicable regulations. The initial disclosure filing is straightforward, but the accompanying communication strategy requires careful consideration, Sarah explained during our meeting to review the documentation. The tone and content of your first contact with management will establish the framework for all future interactions, so it needs to demonstrate both competence and collaborative intent. The Schedule 13D filing that would announce my ownership position included standard language about investment objectives and potential future actions, but it also provided an opportunity to signal my approach and priorities to management and other shareholders. The document needed to be professionally drafted, but not unnecessarily aggressive or confrontational in its language about potential strategic initiatives. I recommend that the initial filing indicate your interest in supporting management's existing strategic plans, while also expressing willingness to engage in discussions about additional opportunities for value creation, Sarah continued. This approach establishes your credentials as a serious investor without immediately creating defensive reactions from the executive team. The communication strategy we developed involved submitting the required disclosure filing, followed by a formal request for a meeting with Chief Executive Officer Robert Hensley and other senior executives to discuss Magnolia's strategic direction and potential opportunities for enhanced profitability and growth. The request would be accompanied by a detailed analysis document that demonstrated my understanding of the institution's business model and competitive position. The analysis document had been months in preparation, incorporating the strategic intelligence Victoria had provided, unknowingly, along with my own research into industry trends, regulatory developments, and competitive dynamics affecting regional banking institutions. The document represented a comprehensive assessment of Magnolia's strengths and opportunities that would demonstrate my capability to contribute meaningfully to strategic planning discussion. The analysis identified three primary areas where additional focus could generate significant value creation for shareholders while maintaining the conservative risk management approach that distinguished Magnolia from larger commercial banks. These recommendations were specific and actionable, supported by detailed financial projections and implementation timelines that reflected realistic assessment of regulatory requirements and operational constraints. The first recommendation involved accelerating the geographic expansion strategy that Victoria had described in her communications about management's planning session. My analysis suggested that the proposed timeline for opening new branch locations was unnecessarily conservative, given the strength of Magnolia's balance sheet and the competitive advantages their relationship-based approach would provide in new markets. The financial projections indicated that more aggressive expansion could increase revenue growth by approximately 40% over 3 years, while maintaining the credit quality standards and operational excellence that supported Magnolia's premium market positioning. The acceleration would require additional capital investment, but would generate returns that significantly exceeded the cost of capital and enhanced long-term competitive positioning. The second recommendation focused on technology investments that could improve operational efficiency and client service capabilities without compromising the personal attention that affluent clients value. The analysis identified specific areas where digital enhancements could reduce processing costs and improve transaction speed, while maintaining the human interaction that differentiated Magnolia from larger banks with more automated service models. These technology improvements could reduce operating expenses by approximately 12% annually, while improving client satisfaction metrics and creating capacity for business growth without proportional increases in staffing costs. The investments would modernize Magnolia's infrastructure while preserving the relationship-focused culture that provided their primary competitive advantage. The third recommendation involved expanding service offerings to include investment management and estate planning capabilities that would complement Magnolia's traditional banking relationships and increase revenue per client while strengthening customer retention. The analysis indicated that affluent clients increasingly preferred working with single institutions that could address comprehensive financial needs rather than maintaining relationships with multiple specialized providers. The expanded services could increase average revenue per client by approximately 60% while leveraging existing relationships and institutional knowledge that Magnolia had developed through decades of serving Charleston's prominent families. The initiative would require hiring specialized professionals and obtaining appropriate regulatory approvals, but the return on investment would be substantial and sustainable. Each recommendation was supported by detailed implementation plans, financial projections, and risk assessments that demonstrated thorough understanding of the regulatory environment and operational requirements that would govern successful execution. The analysis was designed to provide management with actionable alternatives that they could evaluate objectively, rather than theoretical suggestions that lacked practical foundation. The preparation of these materials required balancing comprehensive analysis with concise presentation that would respect the time constraints of busy executives while providing sufficient detail to demonstrate genuine expertise. The documents needed to establish my credibility as a serious investor who understood the complexities of banking operations and regulatory compliance. On the morning when I submitted the disclosure filing, I also forwarded copies to Victoria through her corporate email address at Magnolia, knowing that she would likely see the documentation before other family members became aware of the development. The gesture was intentional, providing her with advance notice that would allow her to process the information privately before any potential family discussions about the situation. The email to Victoria was carefully worded to maintain professional tone while acknowledging the personal relationship that might create complexity around my new role as a significant shareholder in her employer. The message expressed appreciation for the insights she had shared about Magnolia's operations and indicated my intention to be supportive of management's strategic initiatives while contributing additional perspectives based on my analytical background. Victoria, I wanted you to hear this directly from me before you see it through corporate channels. I have been accumulating a position in Magnolia Private Bank over the past 18 months, and have reached the ownership threshold that requires public disclosure. The attached filing announces my holdings and expresses my interest in supporting the strategic initiatives that you have described in our conversations. I look forward to contributing positively to the institution's continued success. The response to my disclosure filing was swift and professional. Within 48 hours, I received a call from Robert Hensley's executive assistant requesting my availability for a meeting the following week to discuss my investment objectives and perspectives regarding Magnolia's strategic direction. The tone was courteous but businesslike, reflecting appropriate response to a significant shareholder's request for engagement. The scheduling of the meeting represented a critical moment in my transformation from anonymous investor to recognized stakeholder. The preparation for this initial interaction with senior management would determine whether my advocacy efforts would be received as constructive collaboration or unwelcome interference in established business operations. I spent the week before the meeting conducting final reviews of my analysis and recommendations, ensuring that every aspect of my presentation would demonstrate competence and professionalism while advancing specific suggestions for value creation. The preparation included practice sessions with Sarah Mitchell, who provided guidance about effective communication strategies for shareholder advocacy discussion. The key to successful engagement with bank management is demonstrating that your recommendations are based on genuine understanding of their business model and regulatory constraints, Sarah advised. Generic suggestions about improving profitability or growth will be dismissed as uninformed, but specific proposals that acknowledge operational realities and compliance requirements will receive serious consideration. The advice reinforced my commitment to presenting recommendations that reflected comprehensive understanding of banking operations, rather than theoretical suggestions that ignored practical implementation challenges. The credibility of my advocacy would depend on demonstrating that my analytical capabilities extended beyond financial statement analysis to genuine appreciation of operational complexities and regulatory requirements. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at Magnolia's headquarters in Charleston's Financial District, in the executive conference room where strategic planning sessions and board meetings were conducted. The setting would provide an appropriate environment for serious discussions about corporate strategy and value creation opportunity. I arrived at Magnolia's offices 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, using the opportunity to observe the institutional culture and operational environment that I had been analyzing through financial statements and regulatory filing. The building reflected the conservative elegance and understated prosperity that characterized Charleston's traditional financial institutions, with architecture and interior design that conveyed stability and discretion rather than aggressive growth or innovative disruption. The reception area displayed photographs of Magnolia's founding families and historical documents that chronicled the institution's development over more than a century of serving affluent clients. The displays reinforced the conservative values and relationship-focused approach that provided Magnolia's competitive differentiation while also suggesting potential resistance to strategic changes that might compromise traditional operating methods. Robert Hensley was exactly what I had expected, based on Victoria's descriptions and the research I had conducted about his background and management philosophy. He possessed the refined bearing and confident demeanor of someone who had built his career through institutional advancement and client relationship management, rather than aggressive business development or financial innovation. "Miss Richardson, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today," he said, extending his hand with the practiced graciousness that characterized successful relationship bankers. "I must say your disclosure filing generated considerable interest among our management team and board members." The comments suggested that my investment had already become a topic of discussion among Magnolia's leadership, which was appropriate given the significance of my ownership percentage and the unusual circumstances of someone my age accumulating such a substantial position in a regional banking institution. "I appreciate your willingness to meet with me, Mr. Hensley. I have developed considerable respect for Magnolia's business model and strategic positioning through my research, and I believe there may be opportunities for collaboration that could benefit all shareholders." The meeting included Chief Financial Officer Margaret Walsh, and Chief Operating Officer David Chen, both of whom had been with Magnolia for more than 15 years, and represented the institutional knowledge and operational expertise that provided continuity in strategic planning and business development initiatives. The initial portion of our discussion focused on my background and analytical approach, with particular emphasis on the research methodology that had led me to identify Magnolia as an attractive investment opportunity. The executives were clearly interested in understanding my perspective on the banking industry and the specific factors that had influenced my decision to accumulate such a concentrated position. Your analysis of regional banking consolidation trends is quite sophisticated, Margaret Walsh observed after reviewing the materials I had provided. The sector dynamics you have identified align with our own assessment of competitive positioning and market opportunity. Her response indicated that my research had achieved the primary objective of demonstrating genuine understanding of industry trends and competitive dynamics, rather than superficial analysis based on limited information. The credibility was essential for establishing foundation for productive discussions about strategic alternatives and value creation opportunities. I am particularly interested in your assessment of our expansion opportunities in adjacent markets, David Chen added. The financial projections and market analysis you have provided suggest more aggressive growth potential than our current strategic planning assumes. This comment represented exactly the kind of engagement I had hoped to achieve through my analytical presentation. The executives were evaluating my recommendations based on their merits, rather than dismissing them as uninformed suggestions from an outside investor who lacked understanding of operational reality. The remainder of the meeting involved detailed discussions about each of the three primary recommendations I had outlined, with particular focus on implementation timelines, capital requirements, and regulatory considerations that would influence successful execution. The executives demonstrated genuine interest in the strategic alternatives, while also identifying potential challenges and constraints that would need to be addressed. Your recommendations regarding technology investments are particularly intriguing, Robert Hensley noted. We have been evaluating similar initiatives, but your analysis provides additional perspective on the potential returns and competitive advantages that could justify more substantial investment. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering various aspects of strategic planning, competitive positioning, and value creation opportunities that extended beyond my initial recommendation. The executives were clearly evaluating my capability to contribute meaningfully to ongoing strategic discussions, rather than simply assessing my immediate proposal. As the meeting concluded, Robert Hensley extended an invitation that exceeded my most optimistic expectations for the initial engagement. Ms. Richardson, we would be interested in having you participate in our quarterly strategic planning sessions as an observer if your schedule permits. Your analytical perspective could provide valuable input for our ongoing evaluation of growth opportunities and operational improvement. The invitation represented formal recognition of my standing as a significant shareholder whose input could contribute positively to strategic decision-making process. The opportunity would provide access to information and discussions that would enhance my understanding of Magnolia's operations, while positioning me to influence future strategic initiatives. More importantly, the invitation validated my approach and demonstrated that competence and preparation could earn recognition and respect from experienced executives who were accustomed to working with institutional investors and family offices. The achievement represented proof that analytical capabilities and systematic preparation could create opportunities for influence and recognition that inherited advantages alone could not provide. As I left Magnolia's offices that afternoon, I reflected on the transformation that had been completed through systematic execution of a strategy that my family had dismissed as unrealistic and financially naive. The 5% ownership position represented not just substantial wealth creation, but formal recognition as a serious investor whose perspectives would be considered in discussions about the future direction of a prominent financial institution. The first independent action had been successful beyond my initial objectives. The disclosure filing had triggered appropriate attention and response from management. The strategic analysis had demonstrated competence and understanding that earned respect and credibility. The meeting had resulted in ongoing access to strategic planning processes that would enable continued influence over value creation initiatives. Most significantly, the achievement had been accomplished through systematic application of analytical capabilities and disciplined execution, rather than inherited advantages or institutional connection. The success validated everything I believed about the power of competence and preparation to create opportunities that conventional wisdom considered impossible for someone with my background and circumstances. The transformation was accelerating, and the foundation had been established for the next phase of strategic engagement that would further enhance both my financial position and my influence over Magnolia's strategic direction. The family member who had been dismissed as financially naive was becoming a recognized stakeholder whose voice would carry weight in discussions about the future of a prestigious financial institution. The preparation phase was complete, and the implementation phase had begun successfully. Everything my family believed about wealth creation, business influence, and who deserves to participate in important financial decisions, was about to be challenged by additional results that would make their initial dismissal appear increasingly disconnected from reality. The 3 months following my initial meeting with Magnolia's executive team represented the most intensive learning period of my professional career. The transition from external analyst to participating stakeholder in strategic planning sessions exposed me to operational complexities and regulatory nuances that no amount of theoretical preparation could have anticipated fully. The experience proved that while analytical capabilities provided essential foundation for recognizing investment opportunities, effective corporate engagement required understanding institutional dynamics that could only be developed through direct participation in decision-making processes. My first quarterly strategic planning session was scheduled for early June, providing sufficient time to prepare comprehensively for what would represent my formal introduction to Magnolia's senior management team and board members. The preparation involved studying previous meeting minutes, reviewing current strategic initiatives in detail, and developing specific recommendations that could contribute meaningfully to discussions about the institution's future direction and competitive position. The strategic planning materials provided through my new access to internal documents revealed the sophistication of Magnolia's analytical capabilities and the thoroughness of their approach to evaluating market opportunities and competitive threats. The executive team had developed comprehensive frameworks for assessing expansion opportunities, technology investments, and service enhancement initiatives that demonstrated genuine strategic thinking rather than reactive responses to industry trends. However, the materials also revealed conservative assumptions and implementation timelines that my analysis suggested were unnecessarily cautious, given Magnolia's financial strength and competitive position. The disconnect between potential opportunities and planned execution represented exactly the kind of value creation gap that activist shareholders could address through informed advocacy and strategic guidance. The first strategic planning session was conducted in Magnolia's boardroom, a setting that reflected the institutional gravitas and historical continuity that characterized established regional banking institutions. The room featured portraits of founding family members and displays of awards recognizing community service and business excellence that reinforced the conservative values and relationship-focused culture that provided Magnolia's competitive differentiation. Robert Hensley opened the session by acknowledging my presence and explaining my role as a significant shareholder whose analytical perspective could provide valuable input for ongoing strategic discussion. The introduction was professional and appropriate, establishing my standing as a legitimate participant, while maintaining the collaborative tone that would be essential for productive engagement. Ms. Richardson brings extensive analytical experience in financial services and has demonstrated sophisticated understanding of regional banking dynamics through her investment research, he explained to the assembled executive. Her recommendations regarding expansion opportunities and operational improvements align with several initiatives we have been considering, and her participation in our strategic planning process should provide additional perspective on implementation approaches and market position. The executive team included individuals with decades of experience in regional banking operations, regulatory compliance, and client relationship management. Their expertise provided institutional knowledge and practical wisdom that would be essential for successful execution of any strategic initiative, but their perspectives were also shaped by conservative risk management principles that might limit consideration of more aggressive growth opportunities. Margaret Walsh presented the current financial performance analysis, which demonstrated consistent profitability and steady asset growth that reflected effective execution of Magnolia's traditional business model. The metrics were impressive within the context of regional banking industry benchmarks, but they also suggested potential for enhanced performance through strategic initiatives that could accelerate growth without compromising credit quality or operational excellence. Our return on equity has remained consistently above industry averages, and our efficiency ratios continue to improve through operational enhancements and technology investments, she reported. However, we recognize that sustained competitive advantage will require continued evolution of our service offerings and market position. Her assessment provided opening for discussion about the strategic recommendations I had developed, particularly those focused on accelerating expansion timelines, enhancing technology capabilities that could improve both operational efficiency and client service quality. The conversation needed to balance recognition of current achievements with advocacy for additional opportunities that systematic analysis had identified. The financial performance metrics demonstrate excellent execution of current strategic priorities, I respond. However, my analysis suggests that Magnolia's balance sheet strength and market position provide foundation for more aggressive growth initiatives that could enhance returns, while maintaining the conservative risk profile that distinguishes your institution from larger commercial banks. David Chen presented the operational review, which covered technology infrastructure, regulatory compliance status, and human resources development initiatives that supported current business operations and planned strategic initiatives. His presentation revealed the complexity of banking operations and the multiple regulatory requirements that constrained strategic flexibility while also protecting institutional stability and client interest. Our technology infrastructure has been modernized significantly over the past 2 years, and we have achieved full compliance with all current regulatory requirements, he reported. The operational foundation is solid and capable of supporting expansion initiatives, though additional investments would be required to optimize efficiency and service delivery capability. The operational assessment provided context for my recommendations regarding technology investments and process improvements that could reduce costs while enhancing client satisfaction and service quality. The initiatives would require capital commitment, but would generate returns through improved efficiency and competitive positioning that could support sustained growth. The operational capabilities you have described provide excellent foundation for the expansion opportunities we have discussed, I observe. However, additional technology investments could accelerate efficiency gains and service enhancements that would provide competitive advantages in new markets while reducing incremental costs associated with geographic expansion. The strategic planning discussion continued for 4 hours, covering market analysis, competitive positioning, regulatory considerations, and implementation timelines for various growth initiatives that management had been evaluating. The conversation was sophisticated and comprehensive, demonstrating the analytical rigor that supported Magnolia's strategic decision-making, while also revealing opportunities for enhancement that external perspective could contribute. The most significant learning from this initial strategic planning session involved understanding the regulatory constraints and compliance requirements that influenced every aspect of banking operations and strategic planning. Federal and state banking regulations created complex frameworks that governed everything from expansion approvals to technology implementations, requiring careful navigation to avoid compliance violations or regulatory scrutiny that could impact business operations. Regulatory approval processes for new branch locations typically require 6 to 9 months, depending on market conditions and competitive analysis requirements, Robert Hensley explained when discussing expansion timeline. The approval criteria include detailed financial projections, market analysis, and operational plans
that demonstrates sustainable business potential without compromising existing operations. This regulatory complexity explained the conservative implementation timelines that my initial analysis had characterized as unnecessarily cautious. The expansion opportunities were genuine and financially attractive, but successful execution required thorough preparation and regulatory compliance that extended implementation timelines beyond what purely financial analysis might suggest. The learning extended beyond regulatory requirements to include understanding the relationship dynamics and cultural considerations that influenced strategic decision-making in relationship-focused banking institutions. Magnolia's competitive advantage depended on maintaining client trust and confidence that could be compromised by strategic changes that appeared inconsistent with conservative values or relationship-centered service delivery.
Our client families have banked with Magnolia for generations, and they value stability and continuity above aggressive growth or innovative service offerings. Margaret Walsh noted during discussions about service expansion opportunities, strategic initiatives must be implemented in ways that enhance rather than disrupt the relationship-based culture that provides our primary competitive differentiation. This insight revealed the importance of positioning strategic recommendations within frameworks that preserved institutional culture while creating opportunities for enhanced growth and profitability. The approach required balancing innovation with tradition, efficiency with relationship focus, and growth with stability in ways that respected client expectations, while advancing shareholder interests. The weeks following the strategic planning session involved intensive study of banking regulations, compliance requirements, and industry best practices that would enable more effective participation in future strategic discussions. The education was comprehensive and systematic, covering everything from federal lending regulations to technology security requirements that govern banking operations and strategic planning. I also began developing relationships with individual executives and board members through informal meetings and professional interactions that provided opportunities to understand their perspectives and priorities more thoroughly. These relationships were essential for building trust and credibility that would enable effective advocacy for strategic initiatives that might require management consensus and board approval. Robert Hensley proved particularly valuable as a mentor and strategic advisor who could provide guidance about institutional dynamics and decision-making processes that external analysis could not reveal. His experience with regulatory requirements and client relationship management provided practical wisdom that enhanced my understanding of implementation challenges and opportunities. Successful strategic initiatives in regional banking require building consensus among stakeholders who may have different priorities and risk tolerances, he explained during one of our monthly meetings. Shareholders focus on returns, clients focus on service quality, regulators focus on compliance, and employees focus on job security. Effective leadership involves finding approaches that address all these concerns simultaneously. His guidance helped me understand that effective shareholder advocacy required developing recommendations that created value for multiple stakeholder groups rather than simply maximizing financial return. The approach needed to consider operational impacts, regulatory implications, and cultural fit within the institutional framework that supported Magnolia's long-term success. Margaret Walsh provided equally valuable education about the financial planning and capital allocation processes that governed strategic decision-making in banking institutions. Her expertise in regulatory capital requirements and financial modeling provided insights that enhanced my understanding of the constraints and opportunities that influenced investment prioritization and resource allocation. Banking institutions operate under capital adequacy requirements that limit growth potential and strategic flexibility, she explained during discussions about expansion finance. Every strategic initiative must be evaluated within the context of regulatory capital impacts and long-term financial sustainability. This education proved essential for refining my strategic recommendations and developing implementation approaches that would be realistic within regulatory constraints while still achieving significant value creation for shareholders. The learning process was intensive but rewarding, providing practical knowledge that complemented analytical capabilities with operational understanding. The summer months also brought unexpected challenges that tested my ability to contribute meaningfully during periods of market volatility and competitive pressure. Interest rate fluctuations created uncertainty about deposit costs and lending margins that required careful analysis and strategic adaptation to maintain profitability and growth momentum. The experience of participating in real-time strategic decision-making during uncertain market conditions provided invaluable education about the difference between theoretical analysis and practical implementation under dynamic business conditions. The challenges required creative problem-solving and collaborative decision-making that demonstrated whether my analytical capabilities could translate into effective strategic guidance. Market volatility creates both challenges and opportunities for well-positioned regional banks, I observed during emergency strategy discussions about interest rate impact. Magnolia's conservative risk profile and strong capital position provide advantages during uncertain periods that could be leveraged to gain market share while competitors face margin pressure. My contributions during these challenging periods helped establish credibility and demonstrate that my involvement could provide value during difficult situations, rather than only during favorable market conditions. The experience proved that preparation and analytical capabilities could contribute meaningfully to strategic decision-making under pressure. By autumn, my participation in Magnolia's strategic planning processes had evolved from external observer to recognized contributor, whose recommendations were seriously considered and frequently implemented. The transition represented validation of the systematic approach I had pursued to build competence and credibility through preparation and consistent performance, rather than inherited advantages or institutional connection. The learning curve had been steep, but manageable, requiring intensive effort and continuous adaptation to master the complexities of corporate governance and strategic planning in regulated industry. However, the education had been invaluable for developing capabilities that extended far beyond financial analysis to include operational understanding, regulatory compliance, and stakeholder management that would be essential for continued effectiveness as an activist investor. The quarterly strategic planning sessions had become collaborative discussions where my analytical perspective was integrated with management expertise to develop comprehensive approaches to growth opportunities and operational improvement. The evolution represented successful transition from outside critic to inside contributor who could advance shareholder interests through informed advocacy and strategic guidance. Most importantly, the learning process had demonstrated that competence and preparation could overcome initial skepticism and earn recognition from experienced professionals who valued performance above credentials or background. The achievement validated my belief that analytical capabilities and systematic effort could create opportunities for influence and recognition that traditional advantages could not provide. The foundation had been established for the next phase of strategic engagement that would involve implementing specific initiatives designed to accelerate growth and enhance profitability, while maintaining the conservative risk profile and relationship-focused culture that provided Magnolia's competitive advantages. The learning curve was complete, and the implementation phase was beginning. The implementation of my first strategic recommendation at Magnolia Private Bank began in September, with the acceleration of their geographic expansion timeline, specifically targeting the Savannah market where demographic analysis indicated exceptional potential for relationship-based banking services. The initiative represented a direct application of the analytical framework I had developed during months of preparation, combined with management expertise and operational capabilities that would ensure successful execution within regulatory requirements and cultural expectations. The Savannah expansion had been under consideration by Magnolia's management team for over 2 years, but conservative implementation assumptions had resulted in timeline projections extending into the following decade. My analysis demonstrated that market conditions, competitive positioning and financial resources supported much more aggressive expansion that could capture market opportunities before larger institutions recognized the potential or regional competitors established stronger positions. The financial modeling I had developed indicated that accelerated expansion could generate return on invested capital exceeding 25% annually while maintaining credit quality standards and operational excellence that distinguished Magnolia from larger commercial banking institutions. The projections incorporated comprehensive analysis of market demographics, competitive landscape, regulatory requirements, and operational costs, that provided realistic foundation for strategic decision-making. Robert Hensley had initially expressed concern about implementation timeline compression, citing regulatory approval processes and operational complexity that traditionally required extended preparation periods. However, detailed project planning and risk assessment ultimately convinced the executive team that accelerated expansion was both feasible and strategically advantageous given current market conditions and competitive dynamics. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from